Okay, so the best thing about being a humanities teacher is the same thing that's the best thing about being a humanities student. Of course, we're all both of those things actually. And that is that you're looking along at stuff for whatever reason that you have. And along the way, you find out about other things. And sometimes you find out about cool things. I think a while ago in the Humanities 2 class series, I was looking at the Counter-Reformation and discovered mannerism in El Greco. And I mean, I had noticed El Greco before and liked El Greco, but then I found the history and the sort of conceptual underpinnings of El Greco. So for me, this time around, you know, every time you teach a class, you have experiences like that where you really sort of fill things out. There's much too much for anybody to get their handle on all of it. You know, the thing to do is to have the tools so that you can navigate around and go from here to there and look at things that you like. Anyway, the reason I talk about that at the beginning today is we were doing Picasso and abstract expressionism, postmodernism, notably, I think. And on the corner of my eye, I noticed these Russian abstractionist painters. They're sometimes called Russian abstraction. And they were very striking paintings. And quite a few years ago, also a Kandinsky exhibit actually passed through here in Puerto Rico. So, you know, and Kandinsky, of course, doesn't look like anybody else. So one of the things that was sort of left over for me, I guess, or another thing that I wanted to do, and there are other things I definitely want to go do another video. I want to do a video on Cezanne. I mean, as I say, you go along and you find out about things and you see where your interest is leading you to look further into things. So today I want to talk about these Russian abstract painters. It's very fun art, and it's been a real fun time figuring out how to sort of put across or talk about these modernist abstract painters. I'm going to call these painters, let's go to the slide. Enough about me. Stop the shit. We're going to look at these Russian modernist painters. Revolutionary abstraction. Actually, most of these painters aren't really in step with the Russian Revolution, although they're not necessarily against it. They're not right-wing people. We'll talk about that. It's politicized, and I was wondering about that because to me, as you know, I mean, the whole sort of historical and political context, as well as the kind of scientific and epistemological context, is really important for understanding art and understanding why it's happening and what it is that you're looking at. And here we find a really interesting theoretical. Of course, these 20th century avant-garde Russian people are all into theory. And so another thing I want to say, though, before we start looking at this is just that, and I think I've said this before, I think I said this in the minimalism video. You know, I noticed this art. It was charismatic to me somehow. I enjoyed it, and my enjoyment of it was and is, you know, sort of a visceral, pre-reflective enjoyment. And I think that's an important thing in terms of people's experience with art to express. In my case, it's kind of funny because, you know, obviously I deal with abstractions myself. And so in my sort of visceral, pre-reflective, you know, monkey looks at the art and goes, ooh, that looks cool, which is sort of me. But sure enough, I do like looking at, you know, really abstract art. Finding out the concepts that the artist is working with when you're looking at high concept abstraction is kind of optional, as I think most of those artists themselves would agree. Of course, this is, you know, Russia in the revolutionary period. And so there's a right way and a wrong way of doing things. And these people are really paying excruciatingly close attention to the sort of theoretical basis of what they're doing. So we're going to look at some fun painters and some fun isms today. Just a few selected out of a very, very rich little pocket of culture of the painting culture of Russia in the avant-garde period of the 1920s. Really quite amazing. Okay, excuse me, I'm getting rid of this cough lozenge here. All righty then. So, so a couple things then, just to cue up the historical context here a little bit. of course, Russia has this sort of, personality conflict always because of the whole Eurasian thing, kind of a Maria Carey kind of thing going on there, I guess, where, there's the Russian nobility, which is firmly integrated and grounded in European culture. But at the same time, there is an ethnic difference, according to most people, the Slavic difference. And Russia is a big place, and it's considered kind of a backward place. It was the last place in the world, by the way, that Karl Marx thought would ever have had a Marxist revolution. He was thinking maybe England or Germany, not a big agrarian place like Russia. And so this Russian nobility they would go to Paris. I mean, Paris was their sort of cultural lodestar for a really long time. I mean, all the way back to the Baroque period and ever since. So, Impressionism, some of the really early, like Dada, some of those very early modernist movements, these things were known to the students in St. Petersburg and to the elite in upper class Moscow. So the point of talking about that, the first bullet point on the slide, is that these ideas didn't come out of nowhere. These people were, Russia was ready. Russia was paying close attention both to the French and to the German art scene, which we haven't talked about, although Kandinsky had quite a bit to do with the German art scene. Okay, so right after the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, 1918, Lenin takes power, you had a wide open situation, as you very often do after revolutions. Basically, you had a wide open 1920s. It was, as you would expect, as common sense would tell you, the rise of Stalin and the onset of World War II and the rise of the Nazis in Germany and so on, which put an end to this period of avant-garde Russia, which can be pretty closely identified with the 1920s. I mean, there's always been, of course, an avant-garde in underground Russia, just like everywhere else on Earth. But it was blooming and blossoming and out on the streets in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the 1920s, and all kinds of traffic back, as always, between Paris and Moscow and St. Petersburg. And you had, in fact, Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was sort of the commissar for education, sort of the chief kind of cultural official in the Bolshevik government, the initial revolutionary government. And he was a very cosmopolitan person. In fact, I almost made a slide about this. He was denounced in the New York Times in 1920 because of his teaching abstraction, teaching atheism, teaching all these other things with which many of our modern viewers might not disagree. So he's worth mentioning, Lunacharsky, because he was really part of sort of this opening that existed for a few years after the revolution. And then, as I say, you get socialist realism, where it turns out that, the god of Marxism is Norman Rockwell, sort of, and that was kind of, the end. Although, what is interesting about revolutionary art, both in terms of the Russian Revolution, it's always true about revolutionary art, like it's always got that agitprop, propaganda stuff. So really nice design, really good graphic design. I know I have some Spanish-speaking viewers sometimes, and so you think about that, Latin America has that really fine graphic design tradition, and so they had the same kind of very impressive. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about a couple of movements, and a couple of them started maybe very early. But the first person I'm going to talk about is Vasily Kandinsky, because he's the main event, I think, here, most important of these painters, in my opinion. And so I think I want to get him across. Also, I noticed that in terms of the YouTube traffic that, you know, a lot of people are only going to watch for the first few minutes, which is fine and totally understandable. But then I want to make sure that it's Kandinsky that you hear about. So I'm going to do Kandinsky first. He was a promising careerist as a sort of lawyer and economist and government functionary, but at the age of 30, he just really decided he couldn't do it anymore. As an undergraduate, he'd been an art major, and he moved to Germany. Kandinsky spends large periods of his life in Germany for quite a while, but he went back in 1914 when things were starting to get tense in Russia, and he was in Russia until 1920, all through the revolution, in other words. I mean, he was there, and he was, in fact, close to Lenin and Lunacharsky, who very quickly understood that you did have to set up some kind of revolutionary art establishment. And so at first, Kandinsky was very plugged into that. Kandinsky never had any really bad problems with the, I wouldn't go that far. I'll tell you a story right now. Here we go. Third bullet point. He was uncomfortable because Kandinsky was a pretty serious mystic of a sort of Eastern Orthodox variety, a very mystical branch of Christianity in itself. And so he went back to Germany and taught at the Bauhaus School of Walter Gropius, which had to do with a very powerful engine of modernism, particularly in the area of architecture, which is one of the genres where modernism, I think, had the biggest effect and where you can still see modernism today. And Kandinsky taught at the Bauhaus. He taught painting and he taught other classes there for many years, in fact, 13 years, until, again, with the rise of the Nazis and putting pressure on foreign intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals, and Kandinsky had to go to France. Last bullet point there, he is a philosopher's philosopher. He was intensely, he was trained as someone who prepares documents, after all, as a lawyer. And he was really into the theory, and he has an elaborate kind of philosophy and metaphysics, really, of art. It's recognizable. It's, in fact, I would describe it as classical. We'll go over it very briefly in the next slide, but he has one. He has a fairly well worked out philosophy and metaphysics of art. That's kind of fun. And then I do want to take some time and look at these really nice paintings, and we'll look at them chronologically. So hang on and let me just explain the theory of Kandinsky, and then we'll look at the paintings. So if you think of sort of absolute space versus relative space, right? Relative space, the space defined by the surfaces and the objects. Relative space in the sense that there's the space relative to all the surfaces and solid things. And Kandinsky got the idea that he really wanted to get around all that and get to some kind of absolute space. Think of a kind of absolute space that isn't just space defined by surfaces and relationships, spatial relationships of objects, but rather just pure space. Part of that was because, interestingly, maybe metaphorically, he thought everything was music, really. He's like Schopenhauer this way. He sort of thinks that music is the way that you're getting out of, that you're getting down to what's really there, the real essence of things. I've mentioned a couple times synesthesia. Synesthesia it's normal, and some people have it in a very pronounced effect. It's like when you think maybe that the sound of a trumpet is the color yellow, it just evokes the color yellow for you, or the taste of grape jelly on toast makes you hear the sound of flutes or something. So basically the idea is you have input in one sensory modality and it evokes for you some kind of response in the other. And it really seems to people as if the one thing kind of stands for or relates to the other. We saw with Van Gogh, who was actually had a fairly serious mental illness, that he was very much sort of in the grip of his perceptions of the colors as having moral weight, as being sort of positive or negative. And that sort of was an obsessive quality of his experience with colors. So Kandinsky then freely admits this. He thinks in the same way that, say, Beethoven might have wanted to catalog chords and the emotional responses that they evoked in listeners, Kandinsky wanted to catalog colors, many people have done that, and their relationship to various emotional responses. But Kandinsky also took lines, like two-dimensional lines. Um, he thought, in fact, of the line in this sort of Hegelian way, that a line was sort of a tension between the one direction and the other. And he thought that all of this visual stimulation, both the lines and the colors and tones, he thought they all sort of translated into sound. But, and then when we're done with this, and we'll look at the paintings. Let me step out of this just for fun. Look, so you have this Hegelian notion. What does that mean, Hegelian? Ooh. Well, just this, that you have sort of a thesis. Think of two people just having a conversation, because people do this all the time. Someone has a thesis, something that they just say. The other person says, yeah, but, and they have sort of an antithesis, if you will. Unfortunately, depending on your mood, a lot of conversation does amount to that. But then productively, you get to a synthesis, that is, and that's what useful conversing and useful interacting with people is like, where, one person has their proposition, and then you get the response, and then you move forward together. And it really sort of comes from Heraclitus and ancient Greek philosophy. And in fact, in Kandinsky's case, it really does. And the idea that sort of opposites, the tension between opposites like hot and cold, are moving from hot, moving to cold. This sort of struggle between hot and cold is what introduces energy into the system. And Kandinsky thinks something like that. So then, to get back to this dialectical thing, he thinks this, that after Hegel, right? Because Hegel thinks that the universe is sort of unfolding, if you will. It's a theory of history. And Kandinsky has this kind of Hegelian Marxist theory of history that, for example, the artist then, in taking what's given, say, in the sensory object world, and responding to that and countering that, in Kandinsky's case, remember, erasing all of the objects, and so you get down to the space, is in fact that sort of, not revolutionary, small r revolutionary, not political revolutionary, but just in a broader, more general sense, that the way the universe is moving forward is through this sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis process. And so Kandinsky thinks that the artist is very important in all of that. So that's why then, going back to the theory here. So so then the third bullet point, you have some sort of inner necessity, which is visceral, pre-reflective. That is, it's a response to what? A response to colors and lines and shapes and things. The artist then tries to relate that to something eternal. What's sort of Hegelian / Marxist / Christian about this is that process is actually going in a direction where the eternal is sort of coming to realize itself more and more. So it's a progressive theory of history. And so the inner vibration, when Kandinsky has a synesthesia, then this is the end of the theory now. When Kandinsky has his synesthesia and says he hears things when he looks at these colors and lines and shapes, what you're hearing is that kind of rumble of becoming, right? The becoming of newness, the becoming of what's next, because that's how it works, and it works through this dialectical process. So the artist is kind of a metaphor for every agent, I guess. So this is Kandinsky. Now then, let's look at some. And like a lot of these painters, all of these painters, every painter that you ever look at who moves into abstraction or anything really new, this is true of poets very much as well. It turns out that at the beginning they learned the craft. They spent a few years and they really figured out how to do it. I mentioned Kandinsky. He, at the age of 30, went back to art school and then became a teacher, an art teacher. And then he starts to move into this idea of colors, and he has motifs, sort of his own kind of personal symbolic motifs. Someone riding a horse is in a lot of his paintings. Blue Rider. 1910. So 1910 is really pretty early. At this point, he's in there with people like Picasso and Matisse in terms of what he is. These guys, these Russians, man, we're going to look at a woman painter right next. They are very plugged into what's happening. And so this is a real little trove, this little side branch of modernist painting, the Russians of the avant-garde, wide open 1920s before the rise of Stalin. There's a lot of these painters. They had a big art scene, and there are many, many of these canvases, and they're very nice and very early. This is probably, this is a detail from one of his early watercolors when Kandinsky is now really moving away from objects altogether. And now composition, right? So you've got notes in the sense of forms and colors, and then you can put those, you can form those notes together into compositions. And actually, we're going to look at Kandinsky and then two of the other painters, each who have their own ism, but they all use this word composition to explain their abstract constructions. And here we see him then emptying the space. And so growing into, some of you will recognize the Kandinsky, the classic iconic Kandinsky canvases. There's an early one where he's emptying the space. And now making his composition in space, thinking about sort of the musician making air sculpture kind of thing. And there's a detail. And then you can see sort of this hypnotic effect that he finally starts to achieve. Kandinsky works hard. He makes hundreds and hundreds of these, actually. The excellent sense of composition and color, and I think some of this art, I don't, people think, well, maybe the artist did it first and now people can just do it, but I don't think so. I think it's really, really hard to do that. And here's your classic Kandinsky. When you say Kandinsky at the wine and cheese party, when you're designing the nuclear submarines after you graduate, this is what the people are thinking about, right? This is what a Kandinsky canvas looks like. And interestingly, because it looks like it should be so intellectual, but remember, this is someone who actually wants to get away from reference and representation in order for you to have a more visceral and atavistic experience, sensory experience. Also, you wonder, I mean, there's something that looks kind of Russian, there's something that looks kind of 1920s, and these paintings, as abstract as they are, sort of have that quality. Reminds me of, I saw a photograph of a 1950s spacecraft that had crashed on the moon in the 50s, and there was a picture of it, and it had that kind of 50s styling, the way the 50s cars did. A lot more composition than people think. I mean, making it balanced, trying to do this kind of thing randomly doesn't work, I don't think. When he says composition, he means that you have to work really hard to make it balanced and to make it something interesting to look at, and not something that just looks random. It's not random. Also interested in alternate geometries and relativity theory and all that wonderful stuff. Of course, this is now getting later on. And that's doable. I think it's really nice, though. It's a really nice colors, and does make you think about what a work of art is. And he finally has, by the end, just a very distinctive style, which is extremely influential among illustrators, for example, in magazines and things like that. All right, so let's do 3 isms. They all have some nice paintings. I'll just have a slide to talk about it, and then we'll look at paintings. So Ganchorova and Larionov are lifelong partners, and they're big developers of neo-primitivism. I'll venture an opinion, although I almost hesitate, but Goncharova is a little bit funner than Larionov. She's very political, has a real attitude. Second bullet point, neo-primitivism, like, yes, we're pro-primitivism. We like being primitivists. We like being primitive. We don't like being European, because you European people are a bunch of Caucasian racists, and we're Slavs people, et cetera, down that line, right? Coming at you. And Goncharova has that kind of fighting attitude, and she's funny, so she's interesting. So, neo-primitivism then very much politicized, very much make a statement, very much a revolutionary form. Also, third bullet point, like Russian artists always, they typically focus on iconic Russian things. It is a Russian artist, inevitably a kind of nationalist art. Some of that might even be sort of geographic, because it's just such a big place. I think North American art or New World art might be like that for the same kind of reason, that you're just, you're on your own sort of planet. So of course, I guess this is a good place also to mention another modernist Russian artist, painter, would be Marc Chagall. I only don't, and he also is interested in Russian folk idioms very much. I only am not covering him here because his graphic style is not really abstraction. I would recommend his treatment of the human figure and his treatment of color, in both of which areas he's reminiscent of Matisse, Marc Chagall. So I'll just say that. All right, last bullet point then, but at the same time, then you can see all of these modernist influences, and they're working out with all of these modernist influences. And in particular, Goncharova and Larionov make up their theory of Rayonism, in which they claim what they are exploring is the way that the light beams are interacting with each other. Think Einstein and all that. And they're actually, really nice paintings. I'll show you a couple of the Rayist paintings. So Goncharova, 1908. So, again, think about Picasso or Gauguin, Matisse, and Goncharova, very early, and look at the way she's handling the ground and the background, particularly the way she handles flora, I think is really nice. We'll see that in a couple of other things. She's really got a lot of command. And this one's a strange one, almost looks like something. She's a feminist artist. Here is her painting, Linen. And the Russian words on the paintings, these neo-primitivists are also evoking Russian folk forms, and among other things are these woodcut boards, which often would have all sorts of slogans and mottos and things on them. They're an element in traditional Russian village life. So they're evoking those. Now you see something that looks unmistakably modernist, one of her more famous pictures, the cyclist. Larionov, and you can see neo-primitivist again, but nice treatments of colors. And this is classic Larionov. Again, this is one of these, it's the kind of object that you might come upon in a rural Russian setting, just as a sort of piece of kitsch. And he also displays the same kind of, they have a very easy hand. So these Ryanist paintings are nice. This is a Larionov painting. There's quite a few of them. They are what they are, They were made a long, long time ago. I just like them, to be honest. 1913, just an excellent modernist painting. And as I say, Goncharova has a really nice way of handling flora. She always works on it. There's a detail from another painting of hers. A lot of work to make that. And there's a Larionov again. He had a distinctive use of red. So neo-primitivism and Ryanism. Suprematism, not supremacism, please, but rather suprematism, the suprematism of what? Well, actually, the suprematism of the artist. We're going to look at Malevich. He is sort of the guru of suprematism. He wrote The Non-Objective World. So let me just read out these two quotes from Malevich, which kind of explain suprematism, which is pretty much straightforward. As I say, it's there in the first bullet point. The logical conclusion, that is what you get when you mix political populism, right? So a kind of anti-elitism. So revolutionary art in the sense of street art and anti-elitist and people's art. And aesthetic subjectivism, meaning what? Meaning that what's valuable in terms of aesthetic experience is part of the individual subjective experience, which is, as we've seen, a very overarching kind of modernist trope, this kind of inward-looking attention to the phenomenology of the experience. And suprematism is sort of the, as I say, the logical conclusion of that. I guess Malevich himself gets that, and that's why I called it suprematism. So let me read out those two quotations and we'll look at some of this art. Under suprematism, I understand the primacy of pure feeling in creative art. That's what's supreme, okay? To the suprematists, the visual phenomena of the objective world are in themselves meaningless. That's important because it's going to help us explain some art that we're about to see. The visual phenomena of the objective world are meaningless. It's only what happens inside. The significant thing is feeling as such, quite apart from the environment in which it is called forth. So notice that the feeling is really the aesthetic object. You know, what the aesthetic experience is all about is this feeling that you have, which he says has nothing to do with the environment that's producing the sensory stimulation. There's nothing to do with that at all, he says. So it's also sort of ultimate abstraction, right? Because then the object has disappeared as sort of an item of interest altogether. And then notice the second one that he says, art no longer cares to serve the state and religion. Okay, well, 1 out of 2 isn't bad, right? It no longer wishes to illustrate the history of manners. It wants nothing further to do with the object as such. Art, he says in his manifesto, The Non-Objective World, doesn't want to have anything to do with the object and believes that it can exist in and for itself without, quote, things, unquote. Let's just forget about things, you know, objects. Just like Kandinsky, in a way, Kandinsky said, I don't like objects because objects have surfaces, and surfaces get in the way of experiencing the space. Where we create is in the space. Now, suprematism, you know, since it's not Russian suprematism, and it's not communist suprematism, and it's not Eastern Orthodox suprematism, and it's not, I don't know, Slavic suprematism. It's the suprematism of the inner feeling of the artist, which stops at nothing. And obviously that's not a theory of art that's going to hang it in Soviet Union 1930s, and doesn't, it disappears completely. So here's the inevitable thing. And haven't we already seen it? Yes, we have. We've seen it maybe in color field paintings of the abstract expressionists from the 1950s, for example. We might see something like this. It's kind of inevitable, isn't it? If we're talking about theory of art and philosophy of art and what the boundaries of art are, someone's going to put a big black square on a canvas, hang it on the wall. Sooner or later, in a lot of different movements, someone will do it. What's going on with it here? Well, Malevich's point with these paintings is that, you know, again, he says, look, the source, the exterior environmental source, the sensory input is irrelevant, really. The artist doesn't necessarily have to care about that. The artist is just trying to cause and explore a kind of inner feeling. Uh, and so, you know, that's what's going on. And so he's making that point that that does really almost doesn't, in one level, you could say it really doesn't matter what the artist does at all. Or another level, these aren't, you know, this work of art isn't experienced as a painting. It's experienced by you, inside of you. That's the idea. And that's why a black square or an off-center black circle, which is also sometimes called portrait of a woman, by the way, in the literature. I'm not exactly sure why. And now we see something similar to Kandinsky, and indeed Malevich is very similar to Kandinsky. And in fact, Malevich will even call his paintings compositions in the same way that Kandinsky does. So you've got your black square and your red square, and it's a composition. Another inevitable white on white. And he's exploring this idea. But notice that in the case of Malevich, you really sort of, to understand why he's doing it, it's really hard to understand the theory. Well, now we looked at those extreme, evocative of minimalist paintings, very, very many years before minimalism, by the way. And here he is in 1912, and what is he doing? The Cubists, for example, he is exploring basic shapes. He's looking at basic shapes, that basic forms that he's seeing in what he's looking at. Also influenced very much by Cézanne. Again, Cézanne is one of the sort of advocates or proselytizers of inner form. And these are very early paintings for him to be doing this. And then he also starts to do this kind of collage. Another thing is being up there along with people like Matisse and Picasso, and very much paying attention. 1915. And the piece on the right actually called Airplane or Airplane in Flight. Compositions. And then he gets into his masterpieces, which are these objects. Now, I will say this. If you're looking at this painting, stop looking at it in 2 dimensions and look at it as deep. Look at it as having 3 dimensions. And then, right, you can go back and look at the other paintings where maybe it wasn't getting to you, that you're supposed to be looking at them in 3 dimensions. It starts to explain where he thinks he can go. You know, these are people who think they're laying the ground for future practices. And that really nice subdued palette, the palette, of course, the colors that the artist uses. I think that the big money, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars is bullshit. It smells bad to me. But in any event, this one from 1916 sold for $85 million. I thought you might be interested to know. Which is, you know, as I say, I think that's distorted and perverse, but that's just me. All right, one more. And the reason I want to do this one, because it's like, you might be looking at some paintings, some of these Russian abstract paintings from the 1920s, and you might see 2 canvases that really look quite a lot alike, and you're talking about them, and then, you know, somebody who looks like Trotsky might sort of come up out of the crowd and start telling you, yeah, but you know, those ones over there are completely different from these ones over here, and you're like, but they're the same. So those ones over there are suprematist, but these ones over here are constructivist. It's a completely different theory. I think that's kind of funny. They thought of each other as opponents, but in the 1920s, everybody was making these abstract paintings. Everybody was getting cubism, and they all had tried their hands at cubism. Most of these painters have at least a couple of cubist canvases that they did. So I think it's kind of funny, almost a little bit of an embarrassment, that you get constructivism and suprematism, which are supposedly opposed and antagonistic, and it's like a self-parody, right? Because the paintings are very similar. So what's constructivism? Well, constructivism is embracing materialism, embracing industrialization, embracing, that is to say, the object and this and solidity and the surface, um, industrial forms, urban spaces, a, a, a precursor to Soviet realism, a, uh, a movement that might survive into the 1930s. So again, third bullet point, ironically, they're very similar in their abstraction. They everybody goes through this big abstract period at the same time. But these two schools of artists they have opposite sort of reasons. Okay. So as I say, then, just to sum that up, and then we'll look at the paintings. The last bullet point there. Notice that if you like these paintings like I do, you know, what's nice about them is nice across these sort of genres. They're nice paintings. They had this, you know, there was a right way and a wrong way of doing things, and you're supposed to have a theory, and it was important which sort of theoretical camp you belonged to. You had friends and stuff. It was all politicized like that. And it gets into these kind of Monty Python sort of situations. And then, you know, the reckoning did come. The reckoning came between the abstractionists and the materialists, and abstract painting really definitely did die out in the 1930s. There's always a Russian underground because Russia is very rich in painting and literature and music. Let's look at some Rodchenko. As I said, here we have the third painter of our video today. In the third, well, there's Kandinsky, and then there's Rodchenko, and then there's Larionov and supremacism. But they all call these paintings compositions. And in fact, Rodchenko repeatedly uses this phrase, objectless compositions. Exactly the same phrase, right? Exactly the same idea as Kandinsky. And here's one of these that's, you know, it's just a beautiful, beautiful object. I mean, it's early. If you can see a difference, I mean, so here's someone who thinks of himself as a constructivist, this abstract phase, disc and lid. Okay, it's got an industrial title. That's not a good reproduction. And so here's sort of the ultimate, because I showed you with suprematism, the use of the black circles, presaging by many, many years, the minimalist statements, by the way, of the 50s and 60s. And those were motivated, we saw, by that ideology, the ideology that it really didn't matter what was going on outside the head, that the only valuable aspect of art production and art appreciation was the feeling inside. Now, here's a painter at the same time, and these paintings, the one on the left, I think is called White Circle, and the one on the right is called something like Red and Orange Circles or something. Only this person says that the reason they're making these is because they're celebrating our sort of new industrialized environment, our sort of new mass-produced environment. And they're kind of the artist experiencing the new. So literally identical, right? Paintings, which then you have two people with, you know, beards and glasses, and I would hope glasses of vodka, arguing about theory, right? So anyways, that's pretty funny, because after all, you know, no matter how intellectual we are, or no matter how much we enjoy the abstract side of things, the thing about art is just like wine or music. There isn't really anything that's good or bad. There's really only what you enjoy. That's what it's there for. It's there for you to enjoy it. And so, look around and find stuff that you like and look at it all you want. And if you're somebody who wants to find out about the concepts and the reasons and the motives, like me, then enjoy that too, because that's there to be enjoyed as well. But that visceral enjoyment that you have, you don't need to justify. You don't need to be an intellectual about it. You just need to be a person. And you can enjoy art all you want, because there aren't any rules. And so don't let anyone ever tell you that. To enjoying art, to appreciating art, to looking at beauty, forget even about the boundary of art and anything else. It's just that sort of pure experience, sort of, up or down, positive or negative. And then if you want to think about why is sometimes a very useful thing to think about. All right, anyway, I'll stop. Russian abstraction, particularly Kandinsky, but it's a wonderful island of art that exists in our cultural patrimony.